Hi students, welcome to chapter 45. We're going to take a look at three different sections about community and ecosystem ecology in this chapter. First, we're going to look at the ecology of a community, then how communities develop, and then the dynamics within an ecosystem. So the first thing is, as always, to rank what you know from our objectives right now, and then come back to this a little bit later after we've gone through this section, and then you should see an improvement within your knowledge. And if there's not, you know that that is a section that you're going to want to study and use this as a tool to help direct that for you. So the first thing is what is a community? A community is a bunch of populations of different species interacting with one another in the same environment, the same place at the same time. And then we need to be able to know what sort of species are there. So we'll get a species composition or richness where we can list the different species that are in a community. And then, of course, the species diversity, which is going to be the species richness, and then also the relevant abundance. So, an actual count of how many different organisms of that species there are. And so, if you're in my in-person class, this would be a time where we would go outside and do these counts very quickly, just to sort of get a grasp of what they are. If you're at home, this could be a great time to, look out a window and then just list what do you see. Maybe you see grass and squirrels and palm trees, or wherever you are, what you see. And then get a species diversity. Actually count that abundance. So now I see 3 palm trees, 5 squirrels, 2 honeybees, whatever it might be. And that would be part of calculating what is in our community. And so you can see that different communities are going to have a different structure to them, a different diversity and a different richness. So we can take a look at something like a pine forest where we've got a squirrel, a moose, a hare, a bear, a fox, and a wolf as the animals, and of course our pine trees. And then we have something like a tropical rainforest that might have a kinkajou, a monkey, an anteater, a jaguar, a tapir, a bat, a sloth, plus the ferns and the vines and the trees. So that would be sort of looking at the differences in that species richness, that diversity, and being able to categorize our community. So again, our species composition, such as that coniferous or pine forest, has a very different composition than a tropical rainforest we just saw, right? There's different animals, there's different plants. So we would see then a tropical rainforest, if we actually counted the amount of things there, it would have a higher species richness. And then, of course, a species diversity is just all of those communities and their abundance as well here. And we're going to see there is a greater species richness, a greater species diversity, and a more even distribution within our tropical rainforest compared to that coniferous forest. Ecologists also need to, define an area where a living thing is going to reproduce and live. That is its habitat. And that's something you're probably already familiar with. But we're also going to take a look at something called a niche. And that's more of the role that a species plays within the community. You can kind of define it as their job, but it's more than just a job. It's going to be how this species gets energy and nutrients, all of the things that it needs to survive. And there is what is called the fundamental niche. That's all the abiotic conditions where an organism can survive, even when it's not the best biotic conditions. And then the realized niche is actually where we see them. So usually that fundamental niche is much larger. That's where it possibly could be. And then that realized niche is where we actually see the living thing. And so we can then take a look at some ideas here within our community when we look at a niche is we cannot have two living things occupying the exact same niche at the exact same time. And we have this experiment that was taking place in the 1930s that really illustrates that for us. So we have a test tube where we have a paramecium, this blue guy, P. aurelia, and the population can grow when we put that paramecium into a test tube with food. Then we've got a different kind of paramecium, P. catatum, that will grow in a different petri dish with food. And then if we were to put them both together, well, what we see is that one species will outcompete the other. The P. aurelia survived, the P. catatum died, because we cannot have two species having the exact same role, getting their nutrients the same way, acting as the same job in the environment. Now, if these paramecium aren't giving you a good, concrete example, I like to think of it as my community and my ecosystem. That's like a classroom. And imagine that I'm in there trying to teach you biology, and then there is another teacher in there at the exact same time trying to teach you calculus, right? You're not going to be able to learn very much of either subject because we'll be competing for your attention. It won't work. So that's that same idea here, that we cannot have two species in the same niche at the same time. And that is called our competitive exclusion principle. No two species occupy the same niche at the same time. But then you might be thinking, but wait a minute, I know of ecosystems where, there are birds of prey that eat mice, and they can eat those mice at night, and then they can eat those mice in the daytime. What the heck? That's the same, resource they're using. So we also have something of a principle called resource partitioning. And that's where if we're going to have two living things that will have a similar job in the ecosystem, that we need to separate or appropriate those resources so that there's less competition. A great example are owls and hawks. Again, birds of prey that eat rodents. And we know that owls are hunting at night and hawks are hunting in the day. Because we've partitioned when each thing is using a resource, they're not competing against each other, and they are both able to be in that ecosystem because we really, have a very specialized niche now, and it's not overlapping. A great example from Darwin's time were the Galapagos finches. What we see, and we'll see in a moment, is that we partition the resources, we develop a very specialized niche, And now we can have those many different kinds of finches in the Galapagos Islands. There's also a principle or an idea called character displacement. That's where characteristics tend to become more separated or divergent as a population becomes more isolated. So they'll gain their own characteristics. And a great example from your textbook are barnacles. We have two different species of barnacles. Some are more tolerant to salt spray and being kind of dried out. Others require more water and to be at a depth, or they will dry out. And so we've kind of created these characteristics that are more separated. So again, we're not overlapping those niches. So here's our displacement for our finches. What we see is if they measure the beak size of our birds, we've got a small beak, we've got a medium beak, and we've got a big beak. And if we leave our birds alone on an island, well, then we see that, one bird, it kind of gets the small to medium bell curve of beak. But when we put them all together on an island, they would compete with each other if we didn't, separate what foods they were eating. And the way we can separate those foods is by beak size. So again, alone, we see what was the medium beak kind of has this bell curve, small to medium. When we have alone, we see what was a very small beak is kind of small to medium. But when we put them together, it displaces those characteristics so they can eat different things and not compete. So then one of the most famously studied interactions in our communities is predator and prey. So predation is just one living thing, the predator, eating another. And we think of this as like a wolf eats a deer, but it's also the deer eating a plant. And parasitism is a type of predation. So, for example, some sort of parasite wasp might lay their eggs inside the host. Or we have a parasite worm that impacts the heart tissue of animals. What we see is that the presence of a predator actually decreases prey density. And without a predator, we increase the prey density. And your textbook gives you an example of prickly pear cactuses, and they have flowers and fruits, and moths that will then, eat the prickly pear cactus. And then we will see that when there's a lot of moths, there's less cactus. When there are less moths, there are more cacti. And the population of the predator can be affected by the prevalence of prey or by the lack of prey. A very famous example that has been studied is snowshoe hare and lynx in Canada. Lynx is kind of like a bobcat, large feline predator. Snowshoe hare is a rabbit type animal. And we'll see their graph here where what we notice is that when there is a large amount of predators, they will eat the prey, and then the prey amount will go down. And then that will lead to not having enough food for the predator, and then their populations will drop as well. And then because there's less predation, well, snowshoe hare can reproduce, and then there'll be more of them. With more snowshoe hare, there will be more food available, and then there will be more Canada lynx. So it is this population cycling that occurs with peaks and valleys because of the predator eating the prey, less prey. Now there are less food sources, so predators die. Now there's more space for prey items to reproduce. So here's what we see with that. Again, there are these peaks and valleys, they follow each other and cycle together. But prey items are not just there trying to get eaten. They actually do have defenses to protect them. They have heightened senses. They're often very fast. They have protection on their bodies, whether that is fur or toughened skin or scales. They may have spines and thorns. They can have appendages or tails that can fall off or be ripped off and grow back. They'll have chemical defenses where they taste bad or are poisonous. And then camouflage. Camouflage is going to have this coloration that allows them to hide in the natural environment, or warning coloration. Warning coloration is sort of this startle response where it says to a predator, like, hey, I actually taste bad, or I'm poisonous, or scary, or I look bigger than I normally, am, and stay away from me. And then the last one is a flocking behavior where we're going to, move together, work together in order to, again, scare away our predator. So here's a flounder. It's kind of hard to see because he's camouflaged with the coloration of the sand. Here's our warning coloration. I am big, bright colors. I'm poisonous. Don't eat me. Or then something like my false appendages here, where this is not my head. My head is actually back here. So if this gets attacked, I still get to stay alive because I have my head, hidden and protected. Mimicry is another defense that prey can have. It's where one species resembles another. There is Batesian mimicry, which is there is no defense, but I look like something that is scary. So a king snake has a similar coloration to the venomous coral snake. King snakes are harmless. You can even have them as pets. Coral snakes are venomous and are dangerous. Then there's Mullerian mimicry, which is that the mimic shares a defense, such as bumblebees are black and yellow jackets are black and yellow. Both can sting you. So here are some mimicry examples, giving you both those Batesian and Mullerian. So a hover, or a flower fly, or a longhorn beetle, they don't have stingers, but they're black and yellow. And you might, quickly see them and say, oh, I need to stay away. That looks like a wasp or a bumblebee. Meanwhile, Bumblebee and Yellow Jacket, that's that Batesian mimicry, both have stingers. That being said, bumblebees are pretty docile and don't want to sting you. Yellow jackets, they're a lot more stingy. But because bumblebee, longhorn, beetle, and flower fly all look like yellow jacket, you would avoid them because, you're on first glance not sure, is it a yellow jacket or is it, the fly? And that is, again, that mimicry to hide from predators. We also have what are called symbiosis. This is an association between two different species. We can categorize this as parasitism, commensalism, and mutualism. If we take a look at parasitism, which can also be a type of predation, one species benefits, one species is harmed. Commensalism, one species is benefited and the other species is untouched, no effect. And mutualism is when both species benefit. What we see for parasitism is a parasite gets nutrients from the host. Um, a parasite doesn't want to kill the host outright, but it does get its nutrition from it, so it is harming that host. A lot of small parasites tend to be endoparasites or live inside. An example is like a heartworm in your dogs or cats. And then larger parasites are ectoparasites or are on the outside, like a leech. And again, parasites can impact the host from, very slightly weakening them. We don't even notice, all the way to death over time. So here's an example of what heartworms do. If you have pets, dogs, and cats at home, maybe you give them a heartworm treatment. It's usually a little chewable, or it's an injectable shot that they get once a year, where, heartworms are transmitted by mosquitoes. So a dog or a cat that gets bitten by those mosquitoes, they could get heartworm. The little heartworm babies go to heart tissue and then destroy that heart tissue. There are treatments for pets that are heartworm positive, but it's a long process and it's not always incredibly successful. We need the animal to stay, at rest as it goes through the treatment. And so the best course of action to prevent this parasite is those chewables or that injectable medication that just prevents the heartworm from happening. Commensalism, again, is where one species benefits, the other is not benefited or harmed. It's something like a clownfish living in a sea anemone, or it is a owl living in the hole of a tree. Um, it is a little bit of a kind of fuzzy idea in ecology, because many examples, if we study them more, we find out that they're actually mutualism or parasitism. One example is a bird called a cattle egret. They stay near the cattle and they flush out, or the cattle flushes out the insects that they eat. And also egrets get rid of parasites from the cattle. So, we have to be careful when we look at commensalism that it's not really a mutualism where both are benefiting, or it's not really a parasitism where one's actually being harmed. So here's our example of our cattle egrets by these cattle. They're flushing out insects that they can eat, as well as picking them off of the cattle. So really, both are benefiting when we used to maybe say this was more of a commensalism. Then mutualism is when both members benefit from the association. It doesn't have to be an equal benefit, but they both just need to have some kind of positive that happens. So one example is cleaning symbiosis, where we have cleaner shrimp that will remove parasites from fish. The fish don't have parasites. The cleaner shrimp get a meal. And then humans have bacteria in our intestinal tract. The bacteria get a meal every time humans eat things, and then humans have less infections in our digestive tract because the good bacteria take up the space of any potential bad bacteria. We also see mutualism with our plants and their pollinators. Plants get their gametes, their pollen moved to make seeds. And then, of course, our pollinators are getting food. And there is an example of what we call coevolution with our plants and our pollinators. They both evolved for one another. So we see things like hummingbirds being attracted to flowers that are red and have a very deep, um, flower bell. Something like bees being attracted to flowers that have a nice landing pad for them. And so they have evolved with one another. One awesome example of kind of tying this together is something called a Clark nutcracker. And this example in your book talks about Clark's nutcracker birds relying on the spruce tree here for their seeds. The trees need fire in order to have the seeds open up. Then the birds take the seeds and eat them and spread them around, whether they drop them or they poop or they store them. And then bears come and find the stores of seeds and they eat them. So it's like this nice interconnected, mutualisms that they all need each other. The trees need fire, the birds need the trees, the birds spread the seeds, the bears eat the seeds. So we need all parts of this community. Here's our cleaning symbiosis, where we have our cleaner wrasse. That's a little fish in the mouth of this grouper, removing parasites. It could just as easily eat that little cleaning wrasse, but the grouper is like, no, you know what? They're going to get rid of the parasites. I'm going to let them do that. We're both going to benefit. All right, moving ourselves forward to 45.2. What are the sequence of events that occur for ecological succession, and what are the kinds of ecological succession? So, ecological succession is a change in the community, and it's really replacing what was once there with new things. And every ecosystem has its own goal, right? Like maybe it is a coniferous forest, maybe it is a desert, maybe it is a prairie. There's going to be these climax communities or end goals for each of those. However, this model of how we get there looks the same. So we have something called primary succession, which is how we form soil from exposed rock. Maybe there was a volcano that made new land. Maybe there was a glacier that scrapes all the soil away. Either way, we have exposed rock, we have wind and water making soil. Then we can have small things like mosses and lichen grow. Once those live and die, we add nutrients to the soil, and then we're getting larger and larger things until we reach that final climax community. Then secondary succession is when we've reached that, but then something's changed in the environment and we now have soil, but we've gone back to our small lichen, mosses, grasses, and we need to build back up to that climax community. And our first things that inhabit a space after a disturbance, we call those pioneer species. So here's our example of primary succession. We got this bare rock. A glacier has come and scraped away everything. The first things that can grow are moss and lichen. As they grow and die, they add nutrients to the soil until we can grow small things like these little flowers, tiny shrubs. As those live and die, they add nutrients to the soil. And then we're able to get these low trees like maple and oak trees. those will live and die, and eventually we have our replacement with our high coniferous trees, and then that is our end of that primary succession. We've reached our climax community. Secondary succession happens when we got to that climax community and then something happened, whether it was a forest fire, or a hurricane, or humans deforested and took away the trees. Now we're back at grasses. So we have an existing seed bank, we have soil. It's going to happen much quicker that we move from grass to shrubs to tree to our climax community. Again, our climax community is just whatever is our ending goal in a particular area. That's our stable and mature community. That could be, a pine tree forest. That could be a prairie. That could be a desert. It depends on where you are, because the climate and the soil will determine, what is my climax community. And what we have here with this succession is what we call a facilitation model, where each stage facilitates invasion and replacement to the next stage. So we need the shrubs to live and grow and die, to put enough nutrients in the soil to support the trees that need to live and grow and die, that can support our tall trees at the end. There is also what is called the inhibition model, which is where our colonists that were there and could able to latch on in the environment, they remain and they prevent the growth of other plants. And really, until the colonists are unable to successfully compete against the other species, they remain there. And we do see this happen, where, possibly we've put in an invasive species, one that's not native and doesn't belong, something like kudzu vine. It remains and can even outcompete our native plants, and then we don't see those in our pathway to succession. And then the tolerance model is that different types of plants can be in the same area at a different time. And really, it's just chance that determines which seeds get there and develop first. This is how we get sort of this grass, shrub, forest development, because we can have those three different layers within a forest all getting what they need to survive. Um, and to be fair, for all of these models, we don't really know if succession has an end point, because the processes may not be totally complete. And we could see in the future, more than what we currently have with this climax community. All right, section 45.3 is going to give us some interactions within our ecosystem. We're going to define how living things get their energy and then explain that with some food webs and food pyramids. So, what we see is that an ecosystem is now not just the living things like a community, but it's also the physical environment. So, how those living things interact with the atmosphere, the soil, the water, as well as how the living things are interacting. And we're going to categorize those living things, the biotic components, as their food source. So we have what are called autotrophs that make their own food, and then heterotrophs, which need to eat something. So autotrophs only require the inorganic nutrients and an energy source. So we're going to use carbon dioxide and sunlight to make sugar, for example. So what we know about our autotrophs is they generate their own food We also call them producers because they produce food from nutrients. The most common and the one you're probably most familiar with are photoautotrophs. Those are our land plants and our algae. They do photosynthesis. And then there's chemoautotrophs, which are some bacteria and things that live in like hydrothermal vents that can take sulfur or other chemicals in order to make their food. So here's our algae, here's our plants. These are considered our producers. Then we've got heterotrophs. They eat in order to get their energy source. So they need a organic source of nutrients. We can define them a few different ways. There's going to be consumers as the whole big word for heterotrophs. Consumers consume food that came from a producer. Um, we can have herbivores. They are going to eat plants and algae. We can have carnivores, which only eat other animals. We can have omnivore, which eat both plants and animals. We can have detritivores, which feed on decomposing organic matter. And then decomposers is a more general term for feed on detritus. Detritus is those decomposing things plus, our soil components. And our decomposers are really there to release inorganic chemicals, molecules, which then can be taken up by plants. So here's some example of herbivores. We've got this monarch butterfly caterpillar. We've got a rabbit. They're only eating plants. If we then take a look at a carnivore, we've got a snake and we've got a hawk. We can see that they are eating other living things that then ate plants, eating things or ate plants themselves. So they're getting those nutrients they need from not the sun, but from these other living things. Then we've got our decomposers like bacteria and mushrooms that can break down living things or what once were living things and then return those nutrients to the soil for plants to use. And every ecosystem is really characterized by energy flow and chemicals and how we move them. So energy flow, it starts when producers absorb sun energy and do photosynthesis to make organic molecules, to make sugar. Then those organic nutrients are used by the producer, and only a small amount of them is passed on to consumers. Then my organic nutrients get used by the consumers that ate the producer, and only a small amount of those nutrients move on. And then we can have a higher level consumer that eats the thing that ate the producer. And again, even then, only a small amount. We're going to say about 10% of the energy moves on. And eventually, we run out of energy to move on, and it's just dissipating to the environment as heat. So here's kind of our flow. Sunlight to plants, we lose some as heat. Plants can store sugar that they use, and then something like an herbivore eats them, but we still are going to lose some energy as heat. A fox eats our rabbit that ate our plant. Again, we're losing some energy as heat. Both fox and rabbit, they die and they're decomposed. We're again losing energy as heat to the environment. So energy flows through the ecosystem, again, starting at photosynthesis, but only a small portion of those organic nutrients are passed on, so only a small amount of our energy is passed. Organisms have to use the organic molecules in their body to do their own metabolism and reproduction. Um, so, really, our energy is spent and lost through excretion, defecation, death, um, and not all of the energy we start with moves forward. So here, something like our giraffe eating this plant, in order to do cellular respiration, we're losing some heat to the environment. In order to grow and reproduce, we're losing energy and could end up with, carnivores eating the animal, death and excretion and defecation, all we're losing some energy. So we're not really, for every calorie we're taking in, utilizing all of that energy. A lot of it is lost to the environment. One way that we can model that energy flow is through a food web. Food webs are these interconnecting pathways or webs, as they're called, that show basically who is eating who. We call it a trophic level relationship. We have what is called the grazing food web that is going to start with our producers and go from producer to primary consumer, the thing that eats the producer, a secondary consumer that eats the thing that ate the producer. It's 2 jumps away from producer. And then our tertiary consumer, which is 3 jumps away from producer, or it ate the thing that ate the thing that ate the producer. We also have a detrital food web that starts with the detritus. And the thing is that our detrital organisms, they can be food for above ground carnivores, right? Like insects and mushrooms and bacteria. So we're connecting both of these food webs together. An example of a grazing food web could be that we have leaves that are eaten by an insect that is eaten by a bird that is eaten then by a bird of prey, a hawk, right? So, in this case, we're going to see a picture that has insects, rabbits, deer eating the leaves, birds, chipmunks, and mice eating the fruits and the nuts, caterpillars getting eaten by some of the birds. And so we see that our food web is complex. So we might even simplify it to a food chain, just one pathway of that energy movement. And the arrow points to where the energy goes. Our detrital food web, again, begins with detritus. So we're going to have bacteria, fungus, earthworms. And then earthworms, for example, can be eaten by above ground insects. We could also have something like a shrew, like a little mouse or a salamander, that could eat some of these funguses or bacteria or insects. And again, we'll see that this can become, pretty complex. So we might even simplify it as a food chain, detritus to earthworm to salamander. So here's our food web. What is very fascinating to me as someone who studied ecology is that we don't always know all of the interactions within these food webs. So if we're in an environment that happens to lose any one of these species due to population loss or habitat loss or disease or natural disaster, there can be a large impact because of all of these connections. A really great example, if we look at our little shrew, it's getting eaten by foxes and by skunks. It itself is eating a bunch of insects. Those insects get eaten by mice and chipmunks. So, if this disappears, that impacts the population of skunks, of foxes, of chipmunks, of mice, which then affects snakes. So it's very interconnected, and it's a reason why ecologists study this is so that we can place a value on preserving and protecting species, um, because of their role in these food webs. For example, again, our trophic level is just where within our food chain are you getting your nutrients. And it's got all kinds of different living things that can occupy the same level within a food chain. Then, if we're also looking at how our living things interact with the environment, we need to look at the chemicals. And we have what are called so biology, geology, study of rocks, and chemistry, study of chemicals. So we're going to look at these biogeochemical cycles. So we're going to see that there's living things, there are non-living things that are cycling our water, our carbon, our phosphorus, and nitrogen. And that there are human impacts on all of these cycles. So, as a whole, what we see is that the cycle can include a reservoir. That's where we have the chemical of like unavailable. For example, carbon in shells in the bottom of the ocean. We're not able to use that carbon, it's stored there. Then there's an exchange pool where we can take up the chemicals, whether that's the atmosphere or the soil. And then there's the biotic part, the living part, where those chemicals are in the food chain. And human activities can result in imbalances to these normal cycles. So here's kind of our model where we have a reservoir. Humans might be taking these chemicals from the reservoirs. We might be putting them into the exchange pools or into the community. It depends on what the chemical is and what we're doing with it. But then we've got our exchange pool where we're able to utilize that nutrient. And then we have the living part, the community part, where it's actually cycling through living organisms. So then here's our water cycle. Our planet is made up of about 75% water, but of that water, about 3% of it is fresh, and about 1% of that water is available. Where's the rest of it? Well, it's ice. It's in deep underground water called aquifers. We can't get to it. How do we get to any of our water? Well, we have evaporation that brings liquid water into a water vapor. Then we get clouds where we'll have precipitation. That will be rain or snow. That will have runoff. That again leads to ocean. Um, what are humans doing to the water cycle? Well, we pollute our water. And so, again, knowing that only some of the water that is available, that's not in ice or aquifers and groundwater, is available to use, we need to be mindful of chemicals that are in the air, in the soil, in the water, because it does impact what fresh water we can use. Then the carbon cycle, that's the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide can combine with water to make bicarbonate. Bicarbonate in the water is equal to the carbon dioxide in the air. And the total amount of carbon dioxide in the air has been increasing at a rate that is above what we have historically seen it cycle. And not only is it currently above historical amounts we've seen, it's increasing still. So we have a problem in that carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. It does trap heat on our planet, and it is creating global climate change, again, at rates that we have not seen, um, even in ice cores that date back, thousands of years. So, what are we doing? Well, we burn fossil fuels and we deforest. So, when we dig up these fossil fuels and combust them, burn them, it releases carbon dioxide. When we cut down trees, then we don't have a place for carbon dioxide to be stored as sugar from photosynthesis. What we also see is that we have this excess carbon dioxide sinking into our oceans as bicarbonate, but that makes it acidic. And then we are seeing that, creatures that have shells, they're having a harder time um, acquiring um, their calcium carbonate, um, because we're making really acidic ocean water. Um, what are some things that we can do? Well, planting trees and preserving the forests we do have right now is a great start. Looking for alternative energy sources instead of fossil fuels is another great thing that we can do. The truth is, we are going to run out of fossil fuels. Conservative estimates say that we've got about 50 to 75 years left of oil. We've got roughly that for natural gas as well. And coal, we only have about 200 to 300 years worth of supplies left. And when it's gone, it's gone. We are not able to get it back. So, figuring out with technology as well as other methods for protecting plants and algae to do photosynthesis would be a great start. So here's really that. The greenhouse effect is when we have carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, methane that trap heat on our planet, and it leads to global warming and climate change. And global warming and climate change have a lot of consequences. We'll have glaciers and sea ice melts. Sea level will rise. Coastal agricultural lands can be inundated with seawater, and then our soil is contaminated with salts. Nothing will grow. Places that historically were very dry may see rain and be wet. Places that were, colder will be warmer. Um, so we're going to see a problem with crops as well as health with heat stress, um, and a lot of concern for our future. And when we look at what humans are doing to especially the carbon cycle. Then we've got the phosphorus cycle. Phosphorus comes from ocean sediments. When we have land that uplifts to be mountains, then we weather that rock away. Animals get phosphorus by consuming producers. Phosphate has to be fixed by bacteria to be used by plants. And we can return the phosphate to the soil when plants and animals decompose. What we see is that we use phosphate as a fertilizer source, and then too much of that gets into our waterways and it causes a giant bloom of algae, which at first you might think is not so bad, remembering the carbon cycle, except that when that algae dies, it's decomposed and we use the oxygen. And then when there is no more oxygen in that water, it's called anoxic. Plants and animals will die. And that whole process is called eutrophication. So again, we use our phosphates as fertilizer. It causes eutrophication when there's too much of it. What can we do about this? Well, there are places that have fertilizer restrictions and fertilizer bans when it is like a wet season. And so we need to be mindful of what our fertilizer usage is doing to contribute to our phosphorus cycle. Then there's the nitrogen cycle. Again, nitrogen has to be fixed by bacteria to be utilized by plants. There's nitrification, which is when I make nitrites. Then there is the assimilation. The plants take up that ammonia nitrites from the soil and make proteins and nucleic acids. And then we, the consumers, eat those plants and get those chemicals as well. And then there's denitrification, which is converting nitrate to nitrogen gas. Again, we use a lot of these as fertilizers. Again, the eutrophication can happen when it runs off of our soils and into our water, creating anoxic conditions. Again, a thing to be mindful of is our role in this nitrogen cycle. Well, there is more in this chapter if you are very interested in the human impacts. Otherwise, again, I appreciate you watching this video and happy studying.